Happy 300, degenerates, degeneritos, and degenerati. Welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 300, featuring Alex Pereira versus Jamahal Hill and like a dozen other former current champions. It's a pretty jam-packed card. Everyone is calling it the most stacked they've seen. I thought 299 was pretty stacked too, but it certainly doesn't have the champion pedigree. I don't think that this one had. I'm worried there's going to be some fatigue after this for the other pay-per-views relative to the prestige of the last two, but we'll get to those as they arrive. For now, we've got about 10 fights to talk about, and I should do a bit of a quick recap, I guess, on last week. I know I have got some answering to do for a few different picks that I've missed over not just the last week, but it's been a bit of a rough go since that clean sweep at UFC 298 back in February. We're a long way off from that now, and yeah, I was hoping to keep some good momentum going out of that pay-per-view. Very nearly added another 40 units at UFC Mexico City, but that one Yair Rodriguez pick ended up proving pretty decimating, not going with the Moreno Royval over in that case, and skipped the pay-per-view after that because I recognized there wasn't a lot of, or not the pay-per-view, the fight night after that, because I recognized there wasn't a lot of value on it. But even so, 299 fell short due to the missed pick on Almeida. And then, there's been about at least 2 or 3 missed chalky picks on every fight night since then that has put us back in the red for 2024. Now, if you're a longtime follower of this account, you know last year there was one point where I was something like 80 units in the hole, I think, for 2023 before a crazy run in June ended up turning it around for the entire year for us, and then UFC 292 clinched profit for the year in August. So it's just the way that it goes with this strategy. It's high risk, high reward, and I know that there's going to be I'm confident that I shouldn't say I know. I'm confident there's going to be a turnaround sooner rather than later, just with the way that things have kind of been going in the long-term way that this strategy has worked out for me. I know that there are good times ahead. And I also recognize that a lot of the misses that I have had in the last month plus have largely been the product of fighters that don't really have a big sample size to go off of. If I'm just going from the fight nights since UFC 299, Charalampos Grigoriou, Isaac Dulgarian, Steve Wynn, the Peyton Talbot, Cameron Simon fight, Dylan Budka last week, and Morgan Charriere are just some examples that come to mind relative to last week. And I'll keep this brief because we do have 10 fights to talk about at UFC 300. I wrote kind of a big post the Sunday morning after the card, which I'm sure some of you saw, but you should go check out if you haven't seen it. Just kind of talking about how there was a lot of chatter coming out of that all these fights are, the judging has compromised the sport and it's bullshit. And you can understand people being upset when I think 3 of the fights on the main card to close out the evening all end in split decisions. So I can understand, why some people would have that sentiment, but you really need to take an objective look at the judging relative to the criteria and understand what you're looking at, and then maybe you won't be so upset. So the Budka fight, it kind of went the way that a lot of people were expecting, and I even looked at that and said, the way that he's going to have to win this fight against someone who's clearly a better striker than him and Cesar Almeida is he's going to need to just wrestle and kind of stall for 15 minutes, because I don't even really trust this guy's ground and pound, or at least his ability to blend that with the wrestling. But you also had someone who was 12 years younger that was more experienced going the distance in MMA, and that in some respects figured to translate into at least having sustainable cardio for keeping up that sort of strategy. Didn't end up being the case, and we didn't really have the sample size to see that. And Budko was also someone who had only been submitted. He had never actually been knocked out. But obviously, once it became apparent that he wasn't going to be able to hold Almeida down on the mat and was, really just stalling out, it kind of turned into a Jailton Almeida Curtis Blades situation where it was obvious who the better wrestler was, but the guy was also too content to eat strikes in the clinch, and just the total absence of striking ended up leading to a second round finish. So, there's a lot of people. I mean, anybody that picked the underdog was like, oh yeah, I totally called it. But I'm sure that some of them were probably pretty frustrated, and those are the ones that are probably advocating for the fact that, they are not the fact that they thought Almeida should have won the first round, when reality is they both only threw 2 significant strike attempts, and only one of them landed for each. And the rest of the round was entirely in Budka's control. And you can't score total strikes that don't do tangible damage, especially when they're thrown from a neutral or defensive position. So Budka, I think, justifiably won the first round, and I'm not necessarily happy with that pick given the strong grade that I had on it, but I also recognize that the guy was in a bit of a front runner position. I just didn't really have a ton of options to go off of for chalk picks last week, because I had at least 4 underdogs. 4 underdogs, and for the sake of building parlays, I don't like using any plus odds picks as the legs, regardless of how confident in them I may be. Obviously, the bigger devastating miss of the 3 chalk picks I had last week was the plus 1.5 on Bahamondes Giagos. Head kicks, they happen. We're going to talk about Gaethje later. I picked Poirier against him, and Poirier was winning the first round of their fight back at UFC 291. Won the first round 10-9 on 2 judges' scorecards, and seemed to be building positive momentum before Gaethje just kind of caught him with a meme head kick. And, those and knees, they happen, and they can, end the fight on a dime. They're not super often, or as often as perhaps, conventional fans may be led to believe, but they do happen, and they can totally, swing the result on a dime. And that's basically what happened in that one. Giagos had some concern relative to getting finished early, but Bahamondes didn't really have a strong submission record, and that's where I think Giagos had been submitted more times in the UFC than knocked out. And the only guys that had knocked him out in his MMA career were, I believe, Josh Emmett and I'm blanking on the other name, but pretty big, talented fighter. So he had only been knocked out by really substantial talents previously, and we'll see if Bahamondes ends up being as equally talented as the guys that have previously knocked out Giagos. But even though I was suspect of Giagos's head defense and chin, I didn't necessarily think that Bahamondes was going to put him out with a head kick in the first round, especially given Bahamondes had been to the third round in all of his prior UFC appearances against presumably worse fighters. So that was unfortunate to not see that plus 1.5 go ahead, but I already felt a little bit nervous having to lean on 2 overs as parlay legs last week. But again, there wasn't really a lot based on what I had graded that I felt like I had good value to work with relative to chalk. And then the Charrier fight, I don't think I really need to talk as much about that. Most people think it was a split decision that went the wrong way. I'm inclined to agree with them. There's a big discussion about who actually won the first round. Even though Charrier did more damage and by the definition, did more to kind of bring the fight to an ending result with the early submission attempt. It obviously didn't last very long, and guillotines are kind of a cheap way of interpreting that as like a fight-ending sequence. I know that from the previous week, there were some people that were wanting to score that first round between Blanchfield and Marriott in Blanchfield's favor just because of that guillotine that Furio was kind of able to flip herself out of. But still, that was like a fight-ending maneuver that we didn't necessarily see from Fioro in the first round. So should Blanchfield have gotten it, I think at least one of the judges gave it to her, but the other two scored it 50-45. And to that point, only one of the judges, I think, gave that first round to Charrier. Granted, it was a 30-27, which I don't necessarily agree with. I did think that Mariscal won the third round outright just because of the flurry of ground strikes at the end and the end of round optics. But most people felt that that was a split decision that went the wrong way, and I'm inclined to agree with them. It's hard for me to complain because I did get picks correct on the next 2 split decisions. I did think Damon Jackson won, and most people said Alex Hernandez, that 30-27 that he got was probably the worst scorecard of the night. And, I've been over the Brendan Allen, Chris Curtis result in that post that I wrote about the judging. So if you want my full thoughts on that, you can go read that. But essentially, Curtis would have won if his hamstring didn't give out. And the optics that you got from him being hurt, which is kind of what the point of the sport is, who's taking more damage and who's, really reflecting that they are hurt and in a compromised position. That's exactly why all the judges unanimously gave the 5th round to Allen. So if you bet Chris Curtis, I understand why you're frustrated, but, it's a bad beat. They happen. So you can't get frustrated. You just have to look ahead and move on, and that's exactly what I did. As soon as the fights ended, I started running grades for UFC 300 just to put what's been kind of a bad streak out of my memory and try to look ahead towards building positive momentum. And that's what we're going to do right now. So without further ado, let's get started with the first fight of the evening at UFC 300, which features former champions Deiveson, Figueiredo, and Cody Garbrandt. Figgy enters 22-3-1 on a bounce-back victory over Rob Font at the beginning of last December. It was his first fight against someone not named Brandon Moreno in 3 years since he beat Alex Perez in one of his title defenses. It was also his bantamweight debut, in which I faded him based on not really thinking that he was going to handle the move up as well, and that Font was going to be a difficult first test for him up a weight class, but he clearly proved that that wasn't the case. Really outclassed Font pretty easily. Garbrandt enters 14-5 on a 2-fight win streak since getting knocked out by Kai Kara France. Has taken a unanimous decision win over Trevin Jones and then knocked out Brian Kelleher in the first round about 2 weeks after Font fought Figueiredo last year. Now, my introduction to Cody Garbrandt, if I'm being honest, because again, as I've said before, I didn't start ripping every fight night until February 2022. So I haven't really been super long into evaluating this game, and that, with the exception of the spectacle of McGregor, that kind of whole period from, I would say, really the entire last decade up until the pandemic, I had basically been checked out of the UFC. So I missed the mythical, well, maybe mythical isn't the right word, but I missed the run of success that Dominic Cruz had in the early stages of the decade. And, most people kind of wondering, is this guy maybe, on his way to GOAT status? Especially after beating the only person that had defeated him previously, Uriah Faber, in their rematch. And then the very next fight, Cody Garbrandt put on what some people called the most, unexpected ass whooping in a title fight in UFC history, perhaps prior to when Strickland beat Izzy last year. Now, the only thing I had, my reference point to Garbrandt was, that famous exchange he had with Cruz in that build-up, where he said, something to the effect of, I ain't never had to chase pussy and I won't, or whatever. And and Cruz just kind of looked at him like, what are you talking about? And ever since I saw Garbrandt say that, I was just like, oh man, I'm so glad this dude got knocked out in 4 of his next 6 fights after that, because what a bunch of bullshit that is. Get out of here, dude. Now, granted, I didn't have the context at that point that Dillashaw had been, probably cheating, and in some ways that may have potentially vaporized much of Garbrandt's career by doing that. But we don't have any reason to believe. I mean, you really can't look at this fight and discount how hard of a hitter Figgy is against what Garbrandt's chin is. And I do think that the line has gotten pretty wide here at this point. I was hoping to be able to play Figgy inside of the 300 range. I don't think that there's really going to be... I mean, most of what you like with Figgy is that there's kind of, at least when he was at flyweight, he was strong enough that there was always going to be kind of all-around finishing upside. He has more, I think, submissions in the UFC than knockouts. Or he might have as many. No, he's got 4 knockouts and 3 submissions. But he hasn't won by knockout since his first win over Joseph Benavidez. And 3 of his last 4 finishes have been submissions. So I do think that that's worth taking into account here. The most likely way people are figuring him to win, we haven't seen him actually win that way in over 4 years now. Now, granted, Garbrandt has a much worse chin than Brandon Moreno, a worse chin than Rob Font. I don't know if I would say a worse chin than Alex Perez, but yeah, I would say a worse chin than Alex Perez, and probably even a worse chin than Joseph Benavidez. So this is maybe the chinniest opponent. Might even have a worse chin than Tim Elliott. This might be the chinniest opponent that he has fought since. I'm going back and looking now. John Moraga only got knocked out twice. Joseph Morales only got knocked out once, and it was by Figgy. Marco Beltran, who's 8-8 all time, only been only been knocked out twice. This could very well be the chinniest opponent that Figgy has fought in the UFC. There's a very realistic argument you can make for that. And this is a guy, Figgy, who, I mean, less than 5 years ago, this guy 30-27 to Alexander Pantoja, the current flyweight champion. And it's not like Pantoja was super young at that point. He was 28 years old. So right in that age where fighters are starting to enter their prime, late 20s into the early 30s stage. And granted, Figgy is now 36. And some people have, like to say, and I'm someone that pretty routinely likes playing age gaps, that this is around the stage where guys can kind of drop off overnight. But it's not. But Garbrandt's 32, so the age gap here isn't, in that 5-year stage yet where it gets super pronounced. And there's no way that you can, even after the wars that this guy had with Moreno, the only knockout loss that this guy's ever suffered was a cut stoppage against an opponent that he had spent almost an hour and a half in the octagon with at that point. And the only person that's ever finished him, period, is Brandon Moreno. And that was by submission. And then obviously the cut stoppage in at the end of their quadrilogy. So I really do understand why Figgy is considered as much of a favorite as he is in this case. I don't think that the line is outrageous by any means, although I do think it's starting to get wide out to the 300 range. I was hoping to make him a parlay leg this week, but if it does get out to 300 with the book that I play with, I'm probably going to have to put off from that. But there's a bunch of Garbrandt hype beasts that are insisting that he's got a puncher's chance. I don't disagree with that, but I just think that this is a really, really bad matchup for Garbrandt given where he is in his career. And even though I think that this fight will probably end by knockout, I don't know how you look at the damage that Garbrandt has suffered since the fight with Dillashaw and come away from this thinking that anybody other than Figgy is going to be the one to get the finish. Trevin Jones is a big hitter, but obviously not nearly as skilled as Garbrandt, any former champion, period. That's probably the biggest hitter. If you look at the fighters that going back to when he first became champion, like Dominic Cruz, not a power puncher, very much more of a point fighter. The powerful hitters that he's faced, Dillashaw knocked him out twice. Pedro Munoz knocked him out. Rafael Asuncao, not a power puncher, and he was able to get the knockout on him at the end of the second round in that one. Rob Font, not necessarily a power puncher, but I would say a more powerful hitter than at least two of the three guys that he's faced, and he lost a unanimous 5-round decision to that guy. Kai Kara France, hard hitter, got knocked out. Trevin Jones, hard hitter, but far less skilled, unanimous decision to Garbrandt. Kelleher, it's difficult. The guy, even though he is a hard hitter, again, it's one of those, doesn't really measure up to the standard of a champion fighters, and, was, I think, 37 when they fought at UFC 296. So there was more of an age gap factor in play there, I think, than what you're going to have for this matchup with Figgy. So I do expect Figgy to win by knockout. I won't be surprised if he does enough damage, not to the point of finishing Garbrandt, that, this goes to a 3-round decision. But I don't think that, based on how we saw Figgy handle the move up to bantamweight in his last fight with Font, I don't think that he's lost enough speed to where Garbrandt is going to be able to take advantage of any of what Figgy may be lacking from the move up from flyweight to bantamweight. This isn't a good matchup for him, and I think that this will be a result that puts Figgy in the conversation for potentially being a bantamweight contender late in his career. I think the division is too crowded to realistically expect him to get another title shot, but this is at least going to make him another intriguing top name in this division, and I think that this is probably the beginning of the end for Garbrandt. But he does have a puncher's chance, and if he does knock out Figgy, like the first person to earn like an actual knockout on him that isn't just a doctor's stoppage, that would be a big statement. So remains to be seen. I'm going with Figgy, but I expect the fight to end by knockout either way. The next fight is Bobby Green and Jim Miller. They're calling it the greatest old man fight of all time. At least until Miocic John Jones happens. Green enters 37 years old with a record of 31-15-1. He was having a banner 2023, got that quick finish over Jared Gordon that was quickly ruled an inadvertent clash of heads and a no contest, but was able to carry over at least some of the good momentum from that into a last-second submission win over Tony Ferguson. That was his first submission in MMA since his UFC debut all the way back in 2013 against Jacob Volkman. He then followed that up with one of the biggest betting upsets of last year against Grant Dawson, in which he knocked out Dawson in a little over 30 seconds with one punch. Then tried to make the most of his ascension back into the rankings by quickly turning around only a couple months later against Jalin Turner and suffered one of the more devastating finishes of last year. And if you don't agree with that, you should just listen to what the commentary team had to say on the call when it happened. He was brutalized by Jalin Turner, who we'll talk about in the next fight. But for now, we've got to discuss Mr. Green as well as Mr. Jim Miller, who enters 37-17, heading into what I believe is his 43rd UFC appearance. This will be UFC fight number 43 for Jim Miller. Who had quite a 2023 himself. Started out losing a unanimous decision to Alexander Hernandez, in which he very nearly was able to get a submission towards the end of the fight after being rather bested, but turned around a few months later, got a knockout win in less than 30 seconds under the debutant Jesse Butler. Followed that up with a submission win in what was a pretty overall dominant performance against Gabriel Benitez at the beginning of January this year. So Miller, who had professed as far back as UFC 276 after his win over Cowboy Cerrone that he wanted to fight at UFC 300, has kept enough momentum and stayed out of enough compromising damage at the age of 40 to get his wish. A lot of people think Miller's got what it takes this week, but Green still enters a pretty considerable favorite. Not quite 2-1, but is as high as minus 190 at some books. I do think that in theory it's justified. If this fight is more of a exchange of strikes than a well-rounded MMA match, this is probably going to be Green's to lose, especially if neither one of these guys, ends up finding something that materializes into a finish within the first half of the fight. The thing is, within the last year, we have seen both of these guys demonstrably have one punch lights out hitting power. which, some people will say the last thing to go is the power when it comes to, a lot of fighters. I don't know how necessarily true that is at lightweight, or even just how true that is, period, relative to when a fighter begins to become washed. In a lot of cases, it's, if the fighter never really demonstrated that they had the one punch lights out power, it's not like it's probably going to find itself at some other point down the line. Green really didn't have any one punch knockouts throughout his career until the Grant Dawson finish last year, which I think is one of the reasons why it caught so many people off guard. Jim Miller has had really good power in recent years. I would say his most impressive win at this point within the last couple was probably Nicholas Mata a little over 2 years ago now. So I think you can probably count on Miller's power just a little bit more than you can on Green's. And if Bobby Green hadn't taken the Jalin Turner fight, if he was just coming in off of the Grant Dawson win, I think he'd probably be maybe as much as a 3-1 favorite. And I would understand why he is as wide of a favorite in this case, and why the line isn't closer to a pick'em. But I just can't agree with that given how brutal the end of the fight with Jalin Turner was, and the fact that this guy that was the 5th knockout that this guy has suffered in his career, and the 3rd loss by knockout in his last 6 fights, which includes knockouts to not only Jalin Turner, but also Drew Dober, who is generally regarded as one of the hardest hitters in the UFC, as well as the current champion of the division, Islam Makhachev, which was a short notice appearance in which Makhachev was able to finish him in the first round. So I do wonder if at 37 years old, if Green hasn't necessarily given himself enough time to recover. When I've spoken about ring rust in the past, I've said that you generally want to see a guy, regardless of what the circumstances of what their last fight was, take about 3 months off. And we're coming up on, we're a little over 4 here in the case of Green, but you just wonder if for the kind of knockout where he was brought in and out of consciousness while covering up and not returning strikes against Turner, if he really has given himself enough time, given his chin, to come back at this stage. And you compare that to Jim Miller, who hasn't been knocked out since his fight with Dan Hooker in 2018, it's pretty clear which one of these guys I think is at a bigger risk of getting knocked out. Now, as I said, Green's got a pretty clear path to victory here if he's just able to manage distance and fight smart, so to speak. He's probably going to be able to outbox Jim Miller, but Miller has shown a much more well-rounded skill set than I think what Bobby Green has offered. And just given the superior, this is a rare case in which Green isn't actually going to be more of a veteran presence than the person he's fighting. I believe he's only got 20. This is going to be his 25th UFC appearance compared to the 43 that Miller's heading into. So this is a rare case where you've got a guy that is out experiencing Bobby Green. Bobby Green's fighting someone older than him, but doesn't, age doesn't really come into play here just because Green's now 37 in his own right. And it's a 40-year-old in Miller who surprisingly has less attrition and history of being finished, at least when it comes to... Both of these guys have been finished. Actually, Green's been submitted twice on top of being knocked out 5 times, so he's definitely wearing more attrition. Miller's been finished 5 times total, but submitted 3 times and only knocked out twice. So I think it's pretty clear which one of these guys has less wear and tear on their chin, even though both of them have been knocked out in the first round before, although in the case of Miller, it's only happened once. So I do think that Miller has good potential to get a finish here and make a big statement at UFC 300. This would be the biggest win he has had, certainly, I think, in years. certainly way bigger than the Mata win. Probably the biggest win he's had since he submitted Clay Guida in 2019. Prior to that, you'd probably have to go all the way back to maybe Thiago Alves in 2016 to point out, a more impressive one. But yeah, I do think that there's good potential here for Miller to find a knockout, just specifically because of the most recent result that Bobby Green has had. And that if we weren't coming off of that Jalin Turner fight, or even if the Turner fight had been ended earlier than what transpired, Green would be in a more justifiable position here as the favorite. So I'm going to be backing Jim Miller. I'll say that he is able sometime at the end of the first round to kind of knock Green off of his equilibrium before ultimately finding a finish in the second round. So give me Jim Miller by knockout. And he says that this isn't going to be his last fight regardless of what happens. But, I mean, look, if he gets a knockout at UFC 300 at 40 years old, it's tough to find a better moment to walk into the sunset, I think, than that. But he says this isn't going to be his last fight regardless of what happens. So we will see what happens. The next fight is Jalin Turner and Renato Moicano. Turner enters 14-7 after knocking out the aforementioned Bobby Green in December. Renato Moicano was a parlay leg for yours truly at UFC Fight Night Dolidze Imavov, in which he was able to best Drew Dober by unanimous decision, getting the better of him in rounds 1 and 3. Moicano had an argument for a 30-27, but an accidental clash of heads that totally split Moicano open unfortunately didn't really seem to get treated as such by the judges, and they gave Dober more credit for that than he perhaps deserved, and Dober as a result was able to equalize the fight going into the final round on the scorecards, but a costly decision to go for another kind of overhead throw allowed Moicano to sort of, take advantage of his momentum and fall into him and keep him on the ground for the duration of the fight, despite several unjustified warnings from Mark Smith that Daniel Cormier called him out for on the commentary. And Moicano was able to win a 29-28 and delivered another riveting octagon speech, which I'm sure many are eager for him to perhaps cue up if he's able to get the best of Turner in this one. Now, what's interesting is that, Turner is more than a 2-1 favorite here, which is crazy because after letdown performances against Daniel Hooker, in which he closed as a nearly minus 300 favorite to the shock of many, and coming off of that disappointing result was only a minus 170 favorite over Bobby Green in a fight that really wasn't close at all. He's now a 2-1 favorite against probably the most, Mateus Gamrot notwithstanding, this is probably the most difficult fight he's had since facing Matt Frivola when he was also a favorite. I did pretty decent amount of tape on this one relative to the other fights just because I have so many other notes about the other guys already. And I just hadn't really updated my my notes on Moicano and Turner. These were actually two of the first guys that I evaluated because they both fought at UFC 272, and that was the very first pay-per-view I ever did my analysis for. So it had been quite some time before I had updated my notes for each of these guys. And, I got a pretty good read on where Moicano was at, but Turner, it was time that I did some updating on, and he has made some improvements, and he's at the age where he would continue to be doing so. I think his footwork has gotten substantially better in the last couple of years, since his fight with Uros Medic, and now going in, or after the Malarkey fight he had at UFC 272, and then facing Brad Riddell when I made him a parlay leg at UFC 276, and then fighting against Gamrot and Hooker. His footwork has gotten a lot better, which is, helps him make the most of his length. If this is a pure striking battle, I do think Moicano's in trouble, even though Moicano is just such an interesting character, because, for all the accolades, or not accolades, but all the love that gets thrown on Calvin Kattar, who we're going to talk about soon, it was only, I think, 6 or 7 years ago that Renato Moicano handed Calvin Kattar a 30-27 almost exclusively through the use of leg kicks, not even needing to take him down. And Moicano is a fighter that has never gotten a knockout in his MMA career, but he's got to be the best striker in MMA that doesn't have a knockout win. I mean, I wouldn't be able to think of another one, because most guys, by the time they get to the UFC, have at least one of them. But it speaks to how well-rounded of a fighter he is, and it speaks to how sharp his fight IQ is. I mean, the thing that I find really interesting about the narrative going into this fight is that everybody is assuming that they say, I don't trust Moicano's chin and he's going to get knocked out. Okay, well, that was kind of the narrative going into his fight with Dober too. But he was a 2-1 favorite over Dober, because everybody knew that he was going to have the path to win through the ground game. Why wouldn't that also be available here? That was how Turner lost to Matt Frivola. People speculate. The reason the fight with Brad Riddell was lined as close as it was because people thought he was going to have that path too. He was an underdog to Mateusz Gamrot for that reason, and he ultimately lost that fight. I thought he should have won based on damage, but they gave it to Gamrot because of the control. And then the Dan Hooker fight is particularly interesting, because that was a fight that Turner was winning, no doubt, in the first round, was winning for most of the second round, and then including getting a crazy head kick that Hooker just somehow ate, which was really surprising given the chin history that guy has. But Hooker was able to roll with it, and Turner just kind of got inexplicably tired at the end of the second. Wasn't really clear if that had to do with his weight miss or not, and that's going to be something else worth monitoring going into this, given the difficult weight cuts that Turner has had in his last few bunch of fights. But Hooker was able to steal the round because he was able to put Turner on the ground and nearly choke him out at the end of the second. And then in the third round, he outright earned a knockdown that was able to deliver a split decision that perhaps should have been unanimous. The judge that scored the fight for Turner gave him rounds 1 and 3, and I think there was a much better argument for Turner winning the second than he had for winning the third. So kind of an inexplicable scorecard there. But we still, Turner fighting off of his back, there's still some concern there, not necessarily in terms of his ability to get up, but just kind of allowing the fight to get there to begin with and get his momentum disrupted. If this fight stays standing for 15 minutes, I don't think there's a doubt that Turner wins, and I think that kind of explains why the line is sitting where it's at. But Moicano is, he averages nearly 2 takedowns per 15 minutes, and he's pretty efficient with them in terms of keeping the fight on the ground and staying in that 3/4 mount, not really going to side control. so that he's able to keep his opponent on the ground and do good ground and pound. Doesn't really use a lot of elbows, which you kind of see with a few different Brazilian fighters, which is surprising. The other guy former lightweight that comes to mind for me is Gilbert Burns, in terms of a guy that has that really good wrestling grappling game, but doesn't necessarily use the type of ground strikes that you would like to see that may result in more fight-ending sequences. But he's still able to do good damage on the ground, and it made enough of an impression for him to beat Drew Dober. And Dober is a guy that has a rep for being one of the hardest hitters in the UFC. And Moicano did exactly what he needed to do in terms of fighting smart to get that where he needed it to be. You compare that level of fight IQ to what Jalin Turner demonstrated against Hooker. I mean, there was kind of a moment where they were trading at the end of the second, and Turner, I don't really think that he barked at him, but he did more than, like, you go back and watch. There was just this weird moment in the second round where they were both, like, very much within boxing range of each other, and Turner's, like, against the fence, and he just kind of, like, he does more than take a deep breath. It's almost like he's about to shout at Hooker, and Hooker just kind of uses that moment where Turner's just kind of like at him or something, and Hooker just uncorks another exchange, and eventually the fight gets to the floor, and Hooker's able to, take his back and put in a submission attempt on him. This could get really weird if Turner ends up giving his back to Moicano, whether it's against the fence or whether it gets to the ground somehow. And I just don't think that there's enough respect being given to Moicano's well-roundedness relative to the fight IQ we have seen from Turner, even though Turner's got all the tools to win this. He's going to be much taller. He's going to have a 5-inch reach advantage. He'll be 6 years younger. And he's got the better footwork, I think, at this stage. So I have it graded razor close. I have enough underdogs at this point on this card that I'm not going to go with Moicano outright, and I recognize that there's still, even though there was the potential to get chinned against Dober wasn't necessarily offering the height and reach puzzle that Turner offers here, while also having similar fight-ending power that Moicano's going to have to navigate. Turner's never been submitted also, so for a guy like Moicano that's never had any knockout wins, that also complicates his path to victory a bit. But the longer this fight goes, Turner does not have a good history of fights that go the distance. And Moicano's got more than 2 times his experience seeing decisions and much more success on the scorecards when doing so. So I think that there's more paths to victory here for Moicano than he's getting credit for. It's just going to be a matter of, does his chin hold up against someone that's going to be the taller, longer fighter that has the ability to finish the fight quickly through strikes. So if Moicano gets out of the first round, this is going to get really interesting, and I look forward to watching this one as a fan because I really, really like both of these guys as fighters, and I wouldn't mind seeing either one of them win. And I'd rather just not bet on it, or at this point, it's too close for me to call in terms of putting a pick out on it. So I would just stay this one out, and that would be my recommendation for a lot of people watching this. Is that don't stress yourself out by putting a wager or a pick in on all of these fights, and then you can't enjoy any of them. Not only am I going to get to enjoy all of the women's fights because I'm not betting on them at this stage, but I'm also going to appreciate the fact that I can just sit back and watch 2 fighters that I really, really enjoy and appreciate duke it out for octagon supremacy. So ever the slightest of lean towards Moicano, but I absolutely recognize why the line is the way that it is, and I just wouldn't bet this fight because of that. The next fight is Sodiq Yussuf and Diego Lopes. Lopes enters 23-6. This is his 5th UFC Dana White Contender Series appearance. He lost a unanimous decision to Joe Anderson Brito in 2021. Fought a couple times in Fury and then once in Lux Fight League afterwards before making a very short notice, I think if only a couple days notice, debut against Movsar Evloev that turned a lot of heads because of his ability to chain submissions together on the ground. If that's the greatest thing that he offers, then a fighter like Evloev may have been perhaps the best possible opponent for him to debut against. He was inexplicably awarded the first round on one of the judges' scorecards, but that same judge didn't award the third round to Lopes, which is the round that most people considered him to win. However, there was another judge that gave a 30-27 to Evloev, so that fight, perhaps he gets some a little bit gassed up, perhaps, in terms of the recollection of having made that fight closer than perhaps it maybe deserves to be remembered for. But he did nevertheless win. I remember taking the plus 2.5 rounds at plus odds on that fight because I thought he would at least be able to survive, and because Evloev has proven to be a decision machine, and that ended up being exactly the case. Then I made him a leg against Gavin Tucker, which was largely done due to the fact that Tucker hadn't fought in, I think, about 18 months or possibly even longer than that. Yeah, it was actually closer to like a little over 2 years. Fought Dan Ige in 2021 and then didn't fight Lopes again until August of 2023. And got armbarred. Then fought Pat Sabatini, and in what was, I think, pretty close to a pick'em, but I think Sabatini was just like the slight favorite, and I went with Sabatini in that one. And Sabatini got chinned pretty bad, but there were already some people wondering how good Sabatini's chin really was after he got put down by Damon Jackson in the first round as well, and I think those concerns were validated by, getting knocked out by someone in Lopes, who had a couple knockouts on his record within recent memory at that point, but is still someone that has a much more impressive submission record than that in the striking, which is why I think the line on this is so interesting, because Yussuf, who enters 13-3, was the favorite heading into his fight night main event with Edson Barboza back in October of last year, despite not having fought for a year and only having fought for 30 seconds against Don Shainis, in which he was able to pick up the first submission win of his MMA career. I had Yussuf as a leg that night. I was on my way to having a pretty good night. I had Chris Gutierrez as a leg. I took the under in the McKinney-Brendan Marotte fight. I picked Darren Elkins as an underdog to beat TJ Brown. And I had Jonathan Martinez as a leg to beat Adrian Yanez as well. All I needed was Yussuf to finish the deal against Barboza, and I was going to have a pretty good night. Now, I wasn't watching the fight because I was at a family's wedding reception, but I did take a peek at the numbers, and I checked in, I think, close to the end of the second round. And my understanding is at some point during the second round, it looked like Yussuf was, potentially in a position where the fight was going to get finished, or at least he should have finished it. And it was looking like Yussuf was going to win. That might have been the first round, actually. But in any event, it seemed like the narrative was that Yussuf looked like he was really going to end the fight early, and then the fight didn't end, and Barboza just kept building the momentum and eventually just wound up giving him a veteran lesson that, the fight was lined, I think, fairly close. Yussuf was something like a minus 145 favorite, but I think a lot of people were surprised that it went the distance as much as it did, and that Barboza, despite losing on significant strikes, still ended up getting the victory. So that was kind of the turning point in terms of downward momentum for me last year. I had a pretty good hot streak from end of June through September, and then kind of from there my momentum significantly cooled off. So I have that, despite not watching it live, that Yussuf Barboza fight lives on in devastating memory for yours truly. But even despite that, I mean, if you look at the full body of work that Yussuf has, it's still really shocking to me that the line currently sits in the position that it does. I mean, Yussuf, I don't know if it was a 30-27, but a decision win over Alex Caceres it was a 30-27 on 2 of the 3 scorecards. So, I mean, that's an impressive showing. He did, I believe, take the first round over Arnold Allen in their fight, even though Allen was able to battle back and win 29-28 and earned a knockdown on the way to doing it. But this guy beat Andre Fili by unanimous decision as well. Mike Davis, who is a better fighter than I think perhaps he's gotten to show given his absence, was the guy that Yussuf beat on Dana White's Contender Series, and he also knocked out Gabriel Benitez. So, I mean, there's a decent body of work here that can lead you to understand why he was considered the favorite over Barboza. And you compare that to who Lopes has beaten in the UFC. I mean, if you include the Dana White's Contender Series appearance, he lost to Joe Anderson Brito. And the Evloev fight, he lost 30-27, but on one judge's scorecard. I guess it was 29-28 for the other two, but it was very much more of a situation where he, won the opening 10 minutes and then kind of survived to the end. But it gets remembered just very fondly as like, oh, Lopes showed out so much better than his price, and it, for some reason, gets it's one of the more glamorous losses that people consider, despite the fact that Evloev really controlled the flow of the fight and was able to survive all the submission attempts that he was chaining together. And I already spoke on how Gavin Tucker was a guy that hadn't fought in over 2 years. And Sabatini, there were chin concerns that for some reason, people were taking into account when the fight was in pick'em range. But in terms of glamorizing Lopes's record heading into this fight, everybody just kind of forgets that people were very openly skeptical of what Sabatini's chin was. And then Lopes was able to capitalize on it. So I don't really understand the line here. Lopes is a guy that, in spite of how glamorous his submission game has been in the few fights that we've seen from him in the UFC, this guy still hasn't landed a takedown yet in the UFC. And, unless you're going to get one of those standing guillotines, how are you going to get the fight to where you need it to be in order to implement your submission game? Now, Yussuf doesn't have all-world takedown defense. It's just 62%, which is pretty, pedestrian, not bad, not elite by any stretch. But he still hasn't been submitted yet in his MMA career. And I don't think that Lopes is going to be offering the same level of striking pressure that Barboza did in his last fight to where Yussuf has to be as concerned. The only time that Yussuf has ever lost by decision in his MMA career was when he fought Arnold Allen. And I'm not convinced that Lopes is a prospect to the level that Arnold Allen is. So I appreciate that Yussuf is an underdog here, and I'm happy to play him at plus odds. I think that this is a good bounce back spot for him. I'm looking forward to this fight. I think if Lopes wins, that really will tell us a lot more definitively about where he is as an all-around MMA prospect than just this guy that has been able to really wow with submissions and then take advantage of a very chinny other prospect in his own right in Sabatini. So I think the other thing worth considering here that we haven't necessarily seen yet is that Lopes has been knocked out multiple times. Never in the first round, but he has suffered 2 second-round knockouts previously in his MMA career, although not since 2018. I think Yussuf knows where his bread is going to be buttered in this fight, and I expect him to make enough reads over the course of 15 minutes to take at least 2 of the rounds. So I'm going to say Yussuf wins by unanimous 29-28 decision. We don't necessarily see a bad showing from Lopes, but I don't think that we're going to see enough that in hindsight merits him being the favorite in this fight. I am very, very surprised that the line sits at where it is. And that's why I said when I put the pick out that this seems like one of the most extreme cases of two-way recency bias in modern memory. I think people are over-glamorizing the pair of first-round finishes that Lopes has had, as well as the loss to Evloev, relative to the body of work that Yussuf has put together already in his UFC career, which is more than twice as long as what Lopes has had at this point relative to number of fights and opponents. So give me Sodiq Yussuf. The next fight is Aljamain Sterling and Calvin Kattar. Sterling got knocked out by Sugar Show Sean O'Malley at UFC 292, in which yours truly faded Aljo after correctly playing him as the slight underdog in what was a pick'em against Cejudo. I also picked Aljo to beat TJ Dillashaw, although we obviously know Dillashaw kind of went into that with a compromised shoulder, even though the fight didn't end until well into the second round. Prior to that, I had faded him in his rematch with Peter Yan. Calvin Kattar is a bit of an interesting case. Enters 23-7. Had a very unfortunate knee injury against Arnold Allen in their fight night main event back in October of 2022. Of course, I chose to play the plus 4.5 in that fight and got bit in the ass. Prior to that, I played the under 4.5 given the proclivity for violence that he and Josh Emmett had, and was let down by... I was at least glad that I didn't, play a money line in that fight, because I think I would have slightly favored Kattar. And I decided to take the under in that case, which I think was available at plus odds. And the fight did not end in under 4.5 rounds and instead went to decision. And Josh Emmett won by split in a fight that at the time was heralded as extremely controversial. I think the week after that was when the other controversial decision concerning Tsarukyan and Gamrot happened. And people were calling for Chris Lee's head for quite a while after that. And with all the other sort of judging controversies that have happened since then, people have largely lost sight of that. And it's interesting how many ripple effects that has had relative to Josh Emmett getting a title shot and still kind of being an ever-present face within the top of the featherweight division since that fight happened, compared to Kattar slowly fading out just because he had to take so much time off after the knee injury against Arnold Allen. I wonder what Kattar is going to be able to offer here coming off of that knee injury at 36 years old. I don't think it's realistic to expect that his takedown defense at 91% holds up and that his athleticism is going to be the same. This is also a guy that, despite the reputation for violence that he has, doesn't necessarily have one-punch lights-out power. had a very good first half of his UFC career relative to knockout finishes. The big one, obviously, in his second fight that comes to mind is Shane Burgos, but has not won a fight by finish since the Jeremy Stevens fight, and only has 2 submission wins on his record, the last one of which was a guillotine finish in 2009, well before he got into the UFC. Compare that to the favorite, Aljamain Sterling, as previously said, was 23-4. Sterling, much more well-rounded. And, I've spoken before about in terms of, I know Sterling here is like a minus 145 favorite. I think when I put the pick out, minus 140. Looks like he's mostly sat around that range, although he's gotten out to as far as like minus 170 at some books as the week has gone on. And I just think it's interesting. I've talked about in some of these closer fights before how when you're trying to decide a winner, you just wonder, okay, especially in these kind of striker versus grappler matchups, who's closer to being able to measure up in striking? Can the grappler measure up more to the striker's abilities in the striking than the striker can measure up to the grappler and the grappler's abilities? I don't think we've really seen a lot from Kattar that suggests that he's going to successfully deal with Aljo, like chain wrestling and being opportunistic with back takes when the opportunities present themselves, especially coming off of an injury and with the ring rust that he has. Whereas Sterling, we've seen very, very good kicking game. And even though most people would say his boxing is the weakest part of his MMA skill set, he's still at the same time using that primarily as a good way for setting up his entries and being able to get in on his opponents. O'Malley, I think, offers a different problem than Kattar does in the sense that O'Malley's got very much more visible and proven power than what Sterling is going to have to deal with here. And I think that the move up in weight, even though there's speculation that, Sterling's going to fall off now because he can't weight bully like he did at 135, the move up in weight is only going to aid his chin, which I think for the stage that of his career that he's in is good, especially relative to the stage of the career that Kattar is in. So I do expect Kattar's takedown defense to break. We've seen guys that have elite takedown defense by the numbers get that broken in resounding fashion before. Some of the more recent examples I think of are, obviously people like to point to Peter Yan against Merab. And I'm not saying that Sterling has the same sort of relentlessness that Merab does relative to these takedowns or the gas tank to support that. But the two of them are teammates and and very good friends, and it's reflected in, them training together and their similar fight styles. But I would also, compare the recent result between Anthony Hernandez and Roman Kopylov, in which Kopylov entered with 91% takedown defense, but still ultimately had his broken by Hernandez as well. Something else that I think is interesting relative to making that comparison is Kopylov wasn't necessarily a slow starter, but was a guy that didn't have a big proclivity for first-round finishes and was a guy that would make, spend the first round making reads before really unleashing and going for finishes in the second and third rounds. And I don't necessarily say the same applies to Kattar because we haven't seen a lot of finishes of late from him. But Kattar absolutely has the rep for being a slow starter to where it's cost him in a lot of 5-round fights. And I believe there was even an example when he fought, maybe it was Zabit Magomed Shaparov, where he just because it was the 3-round fight, and he looked the best in the 3rd round, but by that point he had already given away the first 10 minutes and it wasn't really going to make a difference. Something else to consider is that when fighters have had these really long layoffs, they typically aren't as, hip to jumping into it in the first round. And so I think that that's going to create, between, the historic tendency we've seen of Kattar to kind of use the first round to make reads and then move in, I think Sterling is going to be able to capitalize on that, particularly because that's something that he has already demonstrated he can do against fighters that have that similar tendency. That was one of the main reasons that he beat Peter Yan in their rematch, was because Yan was not aggressive enough in the first round and possibly even the second round, and Sterling was able to pounce and outright win those first 2 rounds to make enough of an impression to get a split decision in the second fight. So I really like Sterling here. I think he's at a great price. I think this is a really good opponent to give him in terms of proving that he could, potentially do something at 145. I don't really know what his future in this division looks like, just because I think that there's going to be fighters that are more well-rounded than what he's necessarily had to deal with, that are going to be able to give him more resistance with what he's comfortable with. But I do expect him to have a very good showing here. I don't necessarily expect him to give Kattar his first submission loss since Kattar's 4th MMA fight ever, all the way back in 2008. But I do think that he does enough here to at least earn a 29-28, possibly a decision where he's, instead of winning the 3rd round, is really just hanging on after making enough of an impression in the first 10 minutes, and Kattar really not finding his rhythm until the later stages of the fight, much as was the case when he fought Zabit Magomedsharipov. So give me Aljamain Sterling by unanimous decision. The next fight is Jiří Procházka and Aleksandar Rakić. Rakić has not fought since May of 2022, the week after UFC 274. He blew out his knee fighting Jan Blachowicz in a fight that was 1-1 heading into the 3rd round, and Rakić was really starting to put together some good momentum before his knee just gave out on him, and Blachowicz ended up winning a TKO injury, which was the first knockout loss of Rakic's career, which I think is significant relative to, comparing the attrition between these two fighters, especially given Procházka's coming off a knockout loss of his own to Alex Pereira, in which there was some controversy about whether the fight was stopped too quickly, but Procházka kind of buried that himself in the post-fight interview when he said, no, I agree with the stoppage. I was definitely hurt. So kudos to Jiří for kind of pouring water on the flames of doubt in that circumstance, although I think there's some people that are willingly glossing over that this week in terms of wanting to back Procházka in this spot. Now, there's no doubt who the more exciting fighter between the two of these guys is. All right, Jiří knocks people out with meme stuff, which is great. The difference between these two guys is reflected in how they both approached Volkan Ozdemir, also known as Snooze Demir, because Rakić somehow found a way to be a little bit more boring than Ozdemir when they fought in 2019. And in that circumstance, there's a lot of people that felt that Rakić should have won and kind of got robbed a little bit, but there was enough uncertainty that he was given the loss in the split decision in that case, which kind of forced him to go back to the drawing board. And he didn't get any finishes in his subsequent fights. He had to drag Anthony Smith to a decision in a fight that he potentially could have finished much earlier on, and then took a decision win over Thiago Santos in March of 2021. We didn't see him for 14 months after that, and then that was the injury against Blachowicz that has kept him out ever since. Compare that to Procházka, who, again, knocked out Oezdemir and then followed that up with, I believe, a spinning back elbow on Dominic Reyes. It's no doubt who the more impressive, just relative to entertainment fighter is. But sometimes the guys that are, more boring, I mean, they're more boring because it gives them a more consistent and stable career, more longevity in MMA. And in spite of the fact that Rakić is coming off injury, I think that's going to serve him well against a fighter like Procházka. It wasn't necessarily the case against Oezdemir, but Oezdemir is a guy that has had significant problems stalling out in terms of kind of falling in love with just trying to land one perfect strike. With Rakić, he's much more well-rounded and doesn't really go to the well unless he absolutely has to. Very much a guy that, if he recognizes he's just going to be able to beat you by kicking your calf, he'll just do that. I don't think that's going to lead to sustainable success against Procházka, but I do think that the difference between these two fighters in terms of how they operate in fights that may potentially go the distance is definitely worth highlighting here. Jiří has only gone the distance twice in his career, and in at least one of those cases, one of the decisions was only a 2-round decision in 2016. That was the last time he went the distance. Had he gone the distance against Glover Teixeira, he would have lost. Almost everybody was in agreement that Teixeira was going to win that fight had it gone to a decision, and Jiří was just kind of able to reverse things in the last minute and lock up a submission over a guy that ultimately avenged him in Pereira. So I wonder about Jiří's ability to dig deep here. The other result he had going the distance was a 3-round draw in 2014. And we've just seen much better ability to adapt and make reads through rounds from Rakić than what we've seen from Procházka. There's just too many, even though, awkwardness can be a double-edged sword in MMA. It makes it more difficult for opponents to make reads in a lot of cases and, live scenarios. It also leaves you exposed, and that's something that Pereira was able to take advantage of. When Jiří tried to mix it up after getting hurt, he kind of got stuck on the cage, and Pereira was able to rain down elbows to the point that it kind of only hurt him even further. And you're now looking at a fighter that's been knocked out 3 times over his career, twice in the first round, compared to Rakić, who, again, that injury loss to Blachowicz, which had to do with his knee more than any damage he suffered on his face, was the first knockout loss of his MMA career. And the only other time he had been finished was in his MMA debut in 2011 via guillotine. So I don't think, in spite of the fact that Rakić is emerging from an injury here, I don't think there's any question that Procházka has the more concerning attrition relative to a potential fight-ending sequence. I don't expect Rakić to aggressively pursue a finish. I would, in fact, not be surprised at all to see him concede the first round. But I think that he's going to settle into enough of a groove and recognizes that he has the better potential and experience down the stretch here, that I think he's going to be able to win the last 10 minutes. I think he protects his head better than Procházka does. He's got much more solid head defense, even just looking at it on numbers, than what we've seen from Procházka. And I think that's going to pay dividends for him here as the fight progresses into later stages. So barring some kind of meme early finish from Procházka, I think Rakić is in a really good position here to win. I'm going to say that he wins a unanimous decision. But it should be a competitive fight, and I think when it is 1-1 heading into the third, it'll make for a really compelling featured prelim. But give me Rakić to win his comeback fight by unanimous decision, 29-28. The first fight on the main card at UFC 300 is Bo Nickal and Cody Brundage. Nickal's 5-0, 2 Dana White Contender Series appearances. All of his fights have ended in the first round inside of 3 minutes. Most recently against Val Woodburn, in which we saw Nickal showcase pretty decent striking power, I would say. Perhaps better. I think it even happened much faster than people were expecting, in spite of the fact that Woodburn was kind of a day notice replacement. That was only Woodburn's 8th MMA appearance, but it was the first time he had been finished, and it happened in less than a minute. So I think it really, Nickal's ability to really pounce on fighters below his skill level, I think at this point isn't really in dispute, which I think is why he's being fed Cody Brundage, who enters this fight 10-5. And was on his way to a 4-fight losing streak that probably would have seen him cut before he was inexplicably elbowed in the back of the head by Jacob Malkoun and awarded a win based off a disqualification. Now, I remember that was the last fight. I had another wedding I was going to that night of Fiziev Gamrot, and that was the last fight that I was able to watch before I actually had to go to the ceremony. And I remember many people saying that Brundage took the easy way out of that one. And then he followed that up with an appearance against Zach Reese, in which if you remember, was just kind of one of the most inexplicable sequences in the history of the UFC, in which there's been only 15 slam KOs, if that, in the entire history of the promotion, and 2 of them happened in back-to-back fights featuring Drakkar Klose and Joe Solecki, and then Zach Reese and Cody Brundage. And of course, I was on the losing side of both of them, and I had Zach Reese as a parlay leg that night, which kind of goes back to what I was talking about in the intro of this podcast in terms of getting bit in the ass by these small sample set favorites, which is something I'm going to have to keep accounting for going forward. But it was still really frustrating to see. Reese looked like he was going to be potentially getting close to an armbar and just kind of got power bombed. Didn't really take a page out of what had happened in the fight previous between Solecki and Klose. So Brundage, could very easily be out of the UFC right now. Perhaps probably should be. Has had a really inexplicable career. Knocked out by Will Knight on Contender Series. Lost a unanimous decision to Nick Maximov, who's no longer even in the UFC. Was then on his way to losing to Dalcha Lungiambula before turning the tables with a guillotine in a fight where I think Lungiambula was like a 2-1 favorite and a very popular parlay piece that night. That was a fight night that I had actually skipped in the very infancy of my analysis. I was dealing with a pretty significant stomach issue that put me in the hospital a couple days later, and just kind of opted to sit out of doing fight analysis that week for other reasons. But I remember a lot of people being very upset about that one. And then the narrative going into his fight with Tresean Gore was that he was going to be an easy fade for someone that had been a tough veteran. And Gore got knocked out for what I think was the first time in his own career. So that was a tough loss to swallow. it was quite unfortunate. I think I had made Gore a parlay leg that night, but I had a couple other bad picks from that night, including the infamous God. Oh, man. This is going to drive me nuts. Hold on. It was, God, who was Raul Rosa supposed to fight? It was Ricky Tercios and Ayman Zahabi. That was the night that I learned not to underestimate Zahabi, and then all the Yavid Basharat bettors learned that lesson 2 years afterwards. So glad I was able to get out ahead of that one. But I did fade Brundage somewhat against Nickal Oleksiejczuk in terms of taking the under 1.5 rounds, and Oleksiejczuk awarded me for that decision. I believe I actually played Brundage as a wide underdog against Rodolfo Vieira, and he was actually able to win the first round on most judges' scorecards before, I guess, gassing himself out or getting caught against Vieira early in the second. And then he had a very, very underwhelming showing against Cedric Dumas, obviously, in which he kind of inexplicably got taken advantage of on the ground in a way that I think many people didn't really expect. And I think that fight kind of reveals the key as to why Bo Nickal is such a wide favorite here. Because if you're not on your P's and Q's, even though Brundage has this All-American wrestling rep, Nickal's obviously world-class already in that regard. And I think he knows it. I think the UFC knows it. And I think that they know that Brundage is a guy that's kind of on borrowed time relative to a bit of the inexplicable luck he had getting his losing streak snapped. And then following it up with one of the other luckier knockouts we've seen in recent UFC memory. And that's why he's in the position that he's in. He's not there to give Bo Nickal a war. That's not how they want this card to start. They want a first-round finish to get the crowd hyped up. Assuming that they're not already filling the stadium in, which they should be, for Figueiredo Garbrandt or for Lopes Yussuf to start the prelims, not the early prelims. But for when the pay-per-view actually begins, they want a first-round finish. They're giving Cody Brundage to Bo Nickal for dinner. And Nickal's not had a single fight end sooner than 3 minutes at this point. All of Brundage's wins in the UFC have been inside of 3 minutes too, so these guys are two fast starters that will get after it. Brundage has already said he thinks that Nickal's kind of being overvalued relative to the betting line in terms of skill set. Brundage is going to be the largest underdog in UFC history, or certainly at least since Alexander Romanov fought Chase Sherman a couple years ago. You can't play Nickal at the price he's at just because it's not responsible, but I think the under 1.5 rounds, I mean, it's been basically a free play for the last two appearances that Nickal has had. I don't see anything from Brundage that would make you think it's any different here. So Bo Nickal under 1.5 rounds. Don't bet the money line. Just look at the props if you must. But be careful, because people like convincing themselves that Nickal's going to do it by submission or that he's going to do it by TKO. And if you played the submission one against Woodburn, you got bit. So I would just play Bo Nickal round one, even though that's probably going to be chalked. But I can't do that obviously with the book I'm at, so I just got to take the over or the under. But even at the juice that the under is on, I think it's well justified. So give me Mr. Nickal to win in the first round. I'll say he does it by submission, but I really wouldn't be surprised if he just grounds and pounds Brundage into paste. And I would like to see it, because betting for or against Brundage has been a highly frustrating experience. The next fight is Arman Tsarukyan and Jalin Dubravks. Tsarukyan's 21-3, 3-fight winning streak. Good for him. Knocked out Beneil Dariush in the first round. So did Charles Oliveira in his most recent appearance, and Oliveira now enters 34-9. Prior to that, last time we had seen him was his title loss to Islam Makhachev. And the time before that, I got to see him in person in one of the greatest one-round fights in UFC history against Justin Gaethje. As I've spoken about on this show before, if you go back to my show that I did for UFC 289 a year ago, Oliveira is my hero, and I can't bet against him. I just won't. I foolishly talked myself into thinking that he was going to be able to get it done against Makhachev as an underdog, and that was a sorely misguided decision. And I've since learned from that. I graded Dariush to beat him, and I didn't trust that at all. And so I decided to play the under 2.5 rounds, and my instinct was very, very much correct. In this fight, I really do think that Tsarukyan should win, which is tragic because, I mean, again, I don't want to bet against my hero, but for what I value in the analysis, there's too much that stands out to me here that makes me concerned. Oliveira is not going to have a significant reach advantage, and the 3 inches of height discrepancy tells me that Tsarukyan, particularly with the fight-ending ability he has shown in recent battles, at least 4 of his last 6, makes me think that he's going to have an easier time finding Oliveira's chin. He's entering 7 years younger, and the only statistical advantages Oliveira has are he's a little bit more efficient in terms of accuracy. Obviously, we haven't seen Tsarukyan win by submission yet, but he did have a streak from 2016 to 2017 where 5 of his 6 victories in MMA came by submission. So he's got that in his pocket. We just haven't really seen him have to deploy it yet, and he's young enough in his career where he could, go to the well much later on. And Oliveira, in part just because he has so much more UFC experience, has 5 times the amount of UFC finishes that Tsarukyan has. But that's about all that you can knock on Tsarukyan for. I'm still pretty confident that he beat Mateusz Gamrot, and so if you discount that loss, the only guy that's beaten him since 2016 is Islam Makhachev, who he could end up rematching in very compelling fashion if he wins this fight. And the unfortunate reality that I think a lot of Oliveira fans haven't really wanted to embrace is that the guy, while borrowed time is a strong term, there's going to be a fall off that comes at some point just relative to how much of an action fighter this guy is. And this guy's been in more wars than I think perhaps, especially high-level wars, than perhaps anybody else in his division at this point, unless you want to consider wars relative to amount of damage sustained that has resulted in getting knocked down. I mean, knocked down against Chandler and Poirier and Gaethje and came back to beat all of those guys. Knocked down against Makhachev, didn't get a chance to come back and win that one. Dariush was the most, I think, overall impressive win that he's had, just because he didn't get knocked down in that one. So most overall impressive win he's had since 2021, despite the fact that he was able to find finishes in 3 of those other 4 fights, all of which were title fights. There's just too much here that makes me think. And Tsarukyan, in a lot of ways, has even though we haven't seen the same kind of submission skills applied in the UFC, I would say just about everywhere else, he's a very, very similar technical fighter to what Oliveira offers, in terms of having extremely well-rounded ground and pound, very good top control, excellent footwork, and a very, very solid wrestling and scrambling ability to complement the kind of grappling game that you want to see from a well-rounded MMA fighter. Tsarukyan's got it all, and he's 7 years younger. People have been saying the line is super baffling this week, and I don't really agree with that. I understand why Tsarukyan is in the position that he's in. I think it's just that there's so much love for Oliveira, and the fact that he is consistently outperformed as an underdog with the exception of the Makhachev fight, that it's people are just saying, oh, how can he be the underdog again after he's won so many times as the underdog? Well, this is a different kind of challenge than he's had to face, I think, in recent years. I mean, he was 32 when he fought Gaethje. Now he's 34. He's going to be very soon on the wrong side of his 30s. And that wasn't the case when he fought Poirier or Chandler, or I can't remember if he was the underdog against Ferguson, but I think that enough people were picking Ferguson in that fight that nobody really expected Charles to dominate with a 30-27 the way that he did. Look, I mean, I think that the best way that you have to play this, I should have made this a stay away, if I'm being totally honest, but I wanted to have more than 8 picks out for, this kind of a pay-per-view. And if I'm going to make this pick, if I'm going to go down with the underdog, I would rather do it in a way that lets me take advantage of the fact that both of these guys have recently, against fighters that have demonstrated an ability to be finished, they've gotten it done pretty early on in the going. So in the majority of their UFC appearances combined, these guys have gotten it done within the first half of the fight. And I don't see why that's going to be any different in this case. I think if Oliveira wins, it's got to be very early on. I think Tsarukyan has more paths to victory and could potentially lengthen this out to a decision if he wants to. But for the sake of him making an impression, I think that it very much more suits him to get this done as quickly as possible and not really fuck around with Charles. So my head says Tsarukyan, my heart says Charles. I'm just going to take the under. I'm going to be rooting for Oliveira the whole time, but I won't be surprised if Tsarukyan ends up knocking him out either early in the second round after doing a substantial amount of damage, in which Oliveira somehow survives to the end of the first before getting knocked down early in the second, or if there's just some kind of crazy scrambling sequence in which Tsarukyan is just a little bit more hip than Oliveira is. Or maybe, there's just some kind of mistake that one of them makes on the ground and Oliveira is able to capitalize and is able to lock up a submission that way. But we've never seen Tsarukyan submitted. So I think that Charles might be able to hurt him in a way that he's able to get some kind of ground and pound finish. But I think that you're better served taking the under at underdog odds in this fight than just kind of betting Oliveira with your heart, because I've gotten bitten for doing that before. Or betting Tsarukyan at the price that he's at, even though I think it's a little bit justified. So give me the under. I'll be rooting for Charles the whole time. I don't necessarily want to see him rematch Makhachev because I don't think that's going to go well, but I'm never going to root against my hero. One of the best fighters ever, certainly the best submission artist ever, and just the kind of story that sets your soul on fire. Just awesome. The BMF title will take place between Justin Gaethje and Max Holloway. Gaethje's on a 2-fight winning streak after that loss at UFC 274 to Charles Oliveira. He has since beaten Rafael Fiziev by majority decision and follow that up with a head kick on Dustin Poirier to claim the BMF title at UFC 291 last year. Holloway, by comparison, after losing his trilogy fight with Volkanovski, had a fight night main event with Arnold Allen last year that he won in pretty convincing fashion before retiring the Korean Zombie at their own fight night event in Singapore later on in August. Man, this fight is a super interesting case because I don't think that Gaethje's really used to facing opponents that are going to match him in terms of volume. But the thing that makes Gaethje such a freak is what Fiziev alluded to in the aftermath of their fight, which is Fiziev said, I've never fought somebody who damages you with literally every strike. Like, if a guy like Fiziev, who is a world-class kickboxer, is giving you that sort of accolade, then you know it's absolutely the case. Now, Gaethje still has a lot of holes defensively that I think are reflected in the stats when you compare him to Holloway. And if you look at the scorecard from his fight with Poirier, when I was watching it live, I really thought that Gaethje had won the first round, but Poirier was starting to settle into a groove, as he had typically done in a lot of these 5-round fights that would see him come back and win. But Gaethje obviously got the head kick, and that kind of just sealed the deal. But the scorecards actually reflected that Poirier won the first round on 2 of the 3 judges' cards. So it would have been interesting to see how that fight would have progressed relative to points if it had continued. But Gaethje was ultimately able to end up winning the fight that way. Now, Holloway, I mean, the guy is known for just being one of these fighters that gets in the matrix and then just can kind of look like he's unbeatable at certain points. Obviously, kind of met his match against Volkanovski, and what a lot of other people are pointing to is the last time that he tried to move up to lightweight in 2019, he was not really able to get the better of Dustin Poirier in a fight that was a rematch between the two of them. And Poirier, the power that he has, was able to make enough of a difference in that fight where people are now wondering, oh, well, if Poirier's power in 2019, had Max not knocked down, but at least hurt and hesitant enough, what is a guy like Gaethje who, given the power that we just alluded to with Fiziev's comments, how is that going to make a difference as Holloway prepares to move back up in weight? I would just caution that, the fight with Poirier was 5 years ago, and so Poirier was 30 in his prime at that point, and is now 35 years old. So Gaethje didn't necessarily get the best version of Poirier, I don't think, and Max certainly did. And now Max is kind of towards the end of his prime at 32 years old. And Gaethje, even though I don't expect age to be much of a factor in this one, Gaethje's much further along in his career and has, taken more damage as a result. Whereas Max, despite throwing a similar amount of volume, albeit somewhat less powerful than what Gaethje's been offering, Max has been able to protect himself much better relative to strikes absorbed and defensive efficiency. And we've seen, even though we haven't seen it lately, over the course of their entire UFC careers, we've seen more well-roundedness from Holloway as well. Not only in terms of takedown efficiency and defense, but also just being able to prove that he's got a bit more of a submission game. Now, I don't expect that to really make much of a difference here. I think this is going to be pretty much a 5-round striking match. And I am worried about, what that kind of power is going to do against Max. But I'm going to trust the fact that Holloway has way more experience going the distance than Gaethje does. I mean, it's kind of amazing that a guy that this is going to be Gaethje's 30th MMA fight, and he's only gone the distance 4 times at this point. Holloway's got 4.5 times as much experience going the distance as Gaethje does. And I think that that's really, really significant, particularly for the amount of 5-round experience that Holloway has had of late. It's kind of amazing that, this is a guy who has only been fighting in 5-round events since 2016. And he had only seen the 5th round since 2019 up until he was able to knock out the Korean Zombie in a fight where Zombie probably could have kept going later if he wanted to, but came out of the corner to start the 3rd round and basically said, I'm going to swing and bang, and if I die, I die. And he died. Not literally, but you understand the point. So I don't expect Max to hurt Gaethje as much as Gaethje's probably going to hurt Max, but I do expect Holloway to make enough reads over the course of 25 minutes that he's able to get at least 3 of the rounds, probably, at least 2 of the last 3, and, potentially steal one of the early ones. But I wouldn't be surprised if Holloway goes down 1-0 in the first round, and then from there it's just making reads that gradually allow him to win 3 of the last 4. So I think Holloway's a good underdog bet here. I would say he has just a little bit more of the knockout upside just for the sheer fact that he's never been knocked out himself. And we've seen Gaethje knocked out twice in the UFC. We just haven't seen it happen since the first time he fought Poirier in 2018. And given that he's at age 35 and has been through his own share of wars and technically has been finished in 2 of his last 5 fights, although in those cases, I think both of them were club and subs, or at least the fight that he had with Oliveira. So I don't expect Holloway to get a submission win here, but we do see how the attrition has already put Gaethje in a spot where it's cost him recent results. So I'm going to say that Holloway wins by, I'll say it's a 48-47 decision, but it's going to be close. But I think that given that he's as wide of an underdog as he is, definitely worth a play here, because I would be curious to see actually when the last time he was an underdog was, because he's been a wide favorite in a lot of fights since then. Okay, so Volkanovski notwithstanding, he was an underdog. He closes an underdog in all 3 fights against Volk. So the last time he was an underdog, other than the Volk fight, and we'll say other than against the Poirier fight, was okay. It was a little bit more recently than I thought. It was in 2017 when he fought Jose Aldo the first time. So that's interesting. And he, obviously won both of those fights by knockout. In the rematch, he was a -250 favorite, and he knocked him out again. So prior to that, he was an underdog, it looks like, against Cub Swanson in 2015 in another fight that I believe was it. No, that was the only time he fight Cub Swanson, but that was also the only time, the last time that he won by submission, interestingly. So not a ton of opportunities to bet Holloway as an underdog over the course of his UFC career, and he doesn't have the best record fighting as an underdog, I guess. I would think it's, 2-4, if that. He was an underdog against Andre Fili, too. But he was also an underdog in 2 fights that he lost to McGregor and Bermudez. So, and the first time he fought Poirier, he was a +450 underdog. So he doesn't have a super strong history of winning as an underdog, but I still think that in this case, he's definitely worth the investment, just given where Gaethje's at in his career and the attrition and the experience going the distance relative to what Holloway offers. So this is going to be an all-time war. I think that's why it's the BMF title fight, but I'd go with the underdog in this case in Mr. Blessed Holloway. And now we come to the main event. Alex Pereira and Jamahal Hill. Pereira enters 9-2 in MMA after a glamorous kickboxing career. Last time we saw him was the aforementioned win over Jiří Procházka in November of last year. Prior to that, he took a split decision win over Jan Blachowicz that I personally did not feel that he won and faded him in that fight. That certainly felt like a situation in which the UFC was trying to compel an Izzy versus Pereira 3 fight, if you will, before Izzy fumbled his title defense against Strickland. And prior to that, I had seen Pereira fall at UFC 287 in what was one of the greatest moments in the history of mixed martial arts. Jamahal Hill, last time we saw him was the beginning of last year when he pretty much dominated Glover Teixeira en route to becoming UFC champion, won a unanimous 50-44, in which I think his 10-8 round was, if not the 5th round, the 4th round, one of the last ones, but really made that one non-competitive. And I think that's why people are speculatively betting Hill as an underdog here, and the line is somewhat narrowed as the week has gone on, which I think is kind of surprising. But I mean, here's what I think people need to consider. If this was going to be, like, if they felt comfortable with Jamahal Hill fighting for the title after tearing his Achilles, why did they wait so long to make that the main event, this main event? You got to remember, I mean, we were, I think, less than 2 months out from UFC 300 without a headlining fight. People were making jokes that, you know, Zhang Weili and Xiaonan were going to be the headlining main event, and that, you know, the UFC had been thoroughly compromised by China with this all-China main event in what was supposed to be a celebration of, you know, the ascension for the premier American combat sports promotion. If the UFC felt comfortable enough with where Jamahal Hill was at in his recovery to have him as the champion that had to vacate his title to, you know, a fight at the end of last year for, you know, the previous champion that had also had it taken away from injury, and then someone who they were trying to set up for a champion versus champion fight in another weight class of a trilogy. I'm talking about Pereira versus Izzy. Why do you think that they wouldn't have just made Jamahal Hill versus Pereira without dragging out the potential main event for the biggest pay-per-view in the history of the company that doesn't involve Conor McGregor or Khabib? It just doesn't make sense. And I think it speaks to the kind of desperate situation that the UFC was in, that they had to go to Hill because their only other option realistically was going to be like Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad, and that's not a fight befitting a a pay-per-view that's the caliber of UFC 300. This one certainly is, but you just have to wonder if relative to when Hill got hurt, if he has made it finally to the end of his recovery. I would think that he feels that he's in a good enough spot, but just for realistically where everyone is, like where how a normal person gets through that injury, what does it look like? Now, I don't usually like speculating on bodily changes that happen between fights in which fighters get injured, just in terms of making observations relative to when they actually get in the cage. But there's a lot of people that have spoken about Hill, visibly looking like he's put on weight since getting injured, which most people will tell you will only further complicate a return from an injury like an Achilles injury. So I don't necessarily worry about where his conditioning is just as much as I worry about how much has that leg recovered for a guy who, despite the fact that he's got pretty decent footwork, I would say he's got solid footwork, but still, fights with a degree of flat-footedness that you certainly don't get from Alex Pereira. And to be fighting a guy like Pereira, who is by no means any longer a front runner, and just has no tell on his low kicks. How easily is Pereira going to be able to compromise Hill with those kicks? Especially given this isn't quite the same situation as the Blachowicz fight, where Blachowicz had kind of already established himself as a well-rounded MMA fighter that's, has a degree of striking, but also has the wrestling and grappling to complement that. Hill, for how lauded he gets as a wrestler, has not landed a single UFC takedown yet. And he's heading into his 9th UFC appearance on top of his Dana White Contender Series appearance. I think that this fight being a pick'em would be much more well justified if we knew Hill was entirely healthy. But I don't think that we've seen enough well-roundedness from Hill just relative to getting those takedowns, combined with the fact that Pereira has, really ascended at this point and has become this kind of mythical striker that, there's no doubt who's got the worst chin between these guys. I don't think Hill's a bit of a similar situation with Rakić, where he's got a knockout loss on his record, but really it's only it's an injury TKO that doesn't really have anything to do with the damage tolerance in his chin. And I think especially if he has put on, a little bit of weight, even though he's going to be cutting down to 205, obviously. If he's going to be fighting at a heavier weight than he perhaps was previously, maybe his damage tolerance has even improved to a certain extent, in which it was probably, already pretty good. Guy went, 4 rounds with Thiago Santos, and dispatched some other pretty dangerous fighters, in relatively quick fashion. The Ovince St. Preux win after what just happened with Kennedy and Ngannou at least looks a little bit more glamorous than it perhaps did before. And the guy did 50-44 Glover Teixeira, but you wonder how much, in the same way that, Teixeira's coaching Pereira, and the insight that Teixeira had from fighting Jiří no doubt helped Pereira in his fight with Jiří. You wonder how much Glover's experience with Jamahal Hill is going to assist Pereira in this case. I don't think Izzy is helping out Jamahal Hill to the same extent. So I think that there's enough advantages here for Pereira to take advantage. And I just wonder about where Hill's at with the injury. has he made it back all the way? And how unforgiving of that is Pereira going to be, given the lack of tell on his leg kicks, and that those are probably just going to be available for him whenever he wants to put them out. So the longer this one goes, the more concerned I get about Hill, in spite of the fact that Hill is the guy that has more experience going the distance in MMA and has never actually lost by decision, even though he's only gone to decision. Well, no, that's not true. He's gone to decision, 5 times, and most recently won the 50-44. So there's no doubt that he's capable of going the distance and has done so in multiple 5-round fights. But we saw Pereira, even though he was presumably losing to Izzy heading into the 5th round of their fight at UFC 281, still had enough left in the tank to get a late finish in that one. And so you wonder about how much Pereira is going to reserve his energy. Pereira did, I think, on at least 2 of the 3 judges' scorecards lose the first round to Procházka. But again, this is a guy that only needs 1 counter to do you in, and a guy that has, even for the fighters that have beaten him like Izzy, they have professed that Pereira has killed them with leg kicks previously. And I just can't look at the lower leg injury that Hill had relative to the danger that Pereira offers in that department and come away thinking that he's just not going to be able to take advantage of that, to the point that it weakens Hill enough to where Pereira can then go in for the kill with a left hook or something else equally as vicious. So I like Pereira here to defend his title. I can understand why people would want to bet Hill, and I would maybe be a little bit more convinced if we knew he was absolutely healthy going into this. But I think the fact that this main event got announced as late as it did kind of tells you what you need to know about where Hill is at. They could have made Pereira Hill much, much earlier than they did if they weren't as desperate to fill that main event slot, 60 days out from one of the biggest pay-per-views in company history. They knew they needed something bigger than Bilal versus Leon Edwards, and they got it. But they got it with someone that may be coming into this more compromised than any of them want to let on, even if he's closer to the end of his recovery than that kind of thinking would seem to imply. It's still one of the most difficult injuries to recover from athletically, and I just wonder if Hill is coming back a little bit too soon, particularly in a sport where a guy like Pereira can just totally nuke your legs with some of the most devastating kicks we've seen from anybody, particularly a light heavyweight. So give me Alex Pereira to win. I'll say it happens by knockout. I've seen some people say 2nd round. I'll say that this gets dragged out a little bit later than that. I'll even say Hill probably takes the 1st round away from Pereira before the toll on the leg kicks really starts kicking in closer into the 2nd round, and then by the 3rd round, Pereira is just ready to go in for the kill. So give me Alex Pereira by 3rd round TKO. And that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 300. We will be back for UFC 301, which I believe features Alexander Pantoja and Steve Erceg. That'll be a very interesting fight. Kudos to Erceg for his rapid ascension. That's going to be taking place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and there's plenty of other interesting fights on the card for that one, including Jonathan Martinez and the return of Jose Aldo. So no shortage of interesting events that I look forward to breaking down on that one, including, my hero of last year, Elves Brenner, facing McTybeck or Olby. I'm sure I butchered that one, but what a fight that's going to be. So I look forward to breaking that one down. But until then, thank you very much for tuning in. Please like, share, and subscribe on Twitter and YouTube, and follow if you haven't already. And I look forward to doing this for you guys again soon. And take care, folks. Enjoy UFC 300.